Eleanor Marsh wrote only 3 words in her diary on the morning of June 4, 1857. She pressed the pencil so hard against the page that the lead nearly tore through. The words were, "I cannot continue." Then she closed the book, tucked it into the flour sack where she kept her most private things, the daguerreotype of her mother, a lock of her son's hair from his first cutting, the last letter Daniel had written her before he got sick, and she got up to make breakfast for her children. She continued, "It was not bravery that got Eleanor out of that bedroll. She would have told you that herself. It was Clara, 8 years old and already watching her mother with that careful look children get when they understand, without having the words for it, that the adult they depend on most is very close to a cliff's edge." Clara had not cried since her father died, not once. Eleanor had cried enough for both of them, in the dark, after the children slept, with her fist pressed against her mouth so the sound would not carry through the canvas. Clara's quiet was worse than tears. It was the quiet of a child holding still so as not to startle something fragile. James was 5, and he still asked for his father sometimes. Not urgently, just the way you ask where you left something, a hat, a pocket knife, when you know it must be somewhere close. "Where's Papa?" he said on the morning of May 12th, the day after Daniel's body went into the ground beside the Platte River at mile 378, and Eleanor had knelt down in the river mud and pulled her son against her and said, "Papa has gone on ahead to get things ready." She believed it enough in that moment to say it without her voice breaking. Daniel Marsh had taken cholera on May 9th. He was dead on May 11th. 14 hours from first symptom to last breath. She had read about cholera in the newspaper back in Ohio, the way people read about things that happen to other families. It had not seemed possible that a man so solid, a man who split cordwood until the sweat ran down his back in January, a man who fixed things before they broke, could be gone in 14 hours. But the trail was full of impossible things. That was the lesson Eleanor was learning, mile by mile, at a pace of 12 to 15 miles a day when conditions permitted. By June 4th, she had been a widow for 23 days. The Hendricks train, 14 wagons, 31 souls, had slowed to accommodate her in the first week. Captain Hendricks, a decent man with a great deal of gray in his beard and not enough patience, had let her be. But 14 wagons cannot stop moving west and reach the Blue Mountains before the snow, and Eleanor understood this without being told. She had read enough about the trail to know what waited for those who lingered too long in the high passes. The Donner Party was only 11 years behind them. People still talked about it in the same breath they talked about being careful. But the oxen, that was the thing. Daniel had driven the oxen. She had ridden beside him on the wagon bench and learned to read their moods, which one pulled stubborn when tired, which one needed the rein held differently in mud. But she had never driven them alone, not for a full day, not through country that asked something new of you every hour. The first 2 days after Daniel died, a boy of 17 from the Pratt wagon had driven Eleanor's team, but the Pratt wagon was falling behind on its own account, an axle that needed constant watching, and Eleanor could not ask them to carry her weight too. She was not built for asking. She never had been. It was Thomas Caldwell who noticed. He had not meant to notice particularly. He was not a man who looked for trouble, and a grieving widow traveling with 2 small children in the middle of the Nebraska Territory was the sort of trouble that had no bottom to it. He was 38 years old. He had his own son to think about, Ely, 16, a quiet boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's tendency to say little and mean more. Thomas had lost his wife 2 winters back, fever. He understood what Eleanor was carrying, more or less. He did not think that made him the right man to tell her what to do. But on June 5th, the morning after Eleanor wrote her 3 words and closed her diary, he watched her try to harness the lead ox for 20 minutes in the gray morning light before he walked over. He did not say anything right away. He came alongside the animal, a big, dull-eyed roan named by Daniel, for reasons now lost, congressman, and settled his weight into the work the way men who know animals do, without fuss. The harness went on. The ox stood. Eleanor looked at him. He looked at her. "I can drive them for a while," he said, until you get the hang of it." She had been prepared for pity. What she found in his face was not that. It was something more like recognition, the expression of a person who has been in water over their head and has, through no particular virtue of their own, found the bottom. She said, "I expect you have your own wagon to drive." "Ailey can manage," he said. "He's a good driver." There was a silence. The train was beginning to move. Captain Hendricks's shout came from the front. "Wagons, roll out," and the morning cracked open around them. "All right," Eleanor said. And that was all. That first day, she sat beside Thomas on the bench and watched his hands on the reins and did not speak much. She was not a woman who spoke to fill space. He was not a man who expected her to. They traveled 12 miles through the flat, sun-hammered country north of Chimney Rock, where the great stone pillar rose 325 feet out of the plain like something left over from a world the current one had no use for. Eleanor had circled the date in her journal back in Ohio. Must see Chimney Rock, the way you mark things you expect to feel wonder at. She watched it pass and felt nothing, or rather she felt it was strange that she felt nothing. That seemed important to record. She wrote it down that night. Past Chimney Rock. It is very large. Thomas Caldwell drove today. The children ate well. A week went by. Then, too, Thomas drove the team each morning and turned the reins over to Eleanor midday when the trail was flat and the oxen settled into their rhythm. He would ride back to his own wagon then, check on Eli, eat something standing up, and return by afternoon. He did not explain this arrangement or ask permission to continue it. He simply appeared each morning alongside congressmen. Eleanor was learning. Not just the oxen, she was learning to read the sky, to judge a stream crossing by the color of the water, to count mile markers against the annotated guide she carried, a copy of Joel Palmer's Journal of Travels that Daniel had worn soft at the spine. She did not know she was capable of this. She had not, until now, needed to find out. Clara stopped watching her mother with that careful look. Not all at once. It lifted gradually like the fog off the Platte in the mornings, until one day Eleanor realized her daughter was simply a child again, running with the other children in the evening when the wagons circled, laughing at something the Pratt boy did with a stick and a grasshopper. They reached Fort Laramie on June 28th, a Saturday, at the 740-mile mark. It was the last real outpost of anything recognizable, a trading post, a blacksmith, a place to rest the animals and repair what had broken. Eleanor sold a rocking chair she had been carrying since independence, one Daniel had made with his own hands, because the extra weight was becoming a problem on the grades ahead. She sold it to a woman at the fort who admired the joinery. She did not cry until she was back at the wagon, out of sight. Thomas found her there. He came around the back of the wagon to check the wheel brake, the way he always did at camp, and there she was, sitting on the step with her face in her hands. He stopped. He did not try to say anything useful. He sat down on a barrel nearby, not close enough to intrude, and simply stayed there. After a while she lifted her head and said, "He made that chair himself. It took him all winter." "I know," Thomas said. "You told me." She hadn't realized she had. "It was foolish to bring it this far," he said. "It wasn't foolish. You brought it as long as you could." That was the thing about Thomas Caldwell. He had a way of saying things that were not comforting exactly. He was not a man built for comfort the way some men were, but that were true in a way that steadied you, like a level set against a crooked frame. The country changed west of Fort Laramie. The flat Nebraska grass gave way to the red and brown rock of Wyoming, to ravines and switchbacks and country that looked like God had been angry when he made it. The trail climbed toward South Pass, the great saddle in the Continental Divide at 7,412 feet, the highest point on the Oregon Trail, though it did not look like a pass. It looked like a broad, bare plain tilted toward the sky, wind-scoured and treeless, with the air thin enough that Eleanor's breath came shorter than she expected. She had begun to feel something on the long climb toward the pass that she did not have a name for at first. It was not happiness. It was too cautious for that. It was more like the first indication, after a long illness, that the fever had broken. A clearing. A possibility. She was managing. more than managing some days. She had driven the team alone for 4 days running near Independence Rock, through country Thomas had described as demanding, and she had not been overwhelmed. Captain Hendricks had nodded at her one morning when the train pulled out, a nod that contained a full sentence. "You'll be all right." She let herself believe it. That was the mistake. Not because believing it was wrong, but because the trail was not finished with her. They were 2 miles past the summit of South Pass, on July 19th, when Eli Caldwell's horse spooked at a snake in the wheel rut and threw the boy sideways into the rocks at the edge of the trail. The sound of it, Eleanor heard it from 3 wagons back and understood immediately what it meant, the way you understand certain sounds without wanting to. She set the brake on her wagon and was moving before her mind had finished the thought. Eli's right leg was broken just below the knee. She could see it even before she reached him, the wrong angle of it against the rock, the way the boy's face had gone the color of old paper. Thomas was already there, kneeling beside his son, and the look on his face was something Eleanor recognized. She had worn that look herself 23 days ago beside a river in Nebraska. The look of a person discovering that the worst thing is not something that happens at a distance. "Hold still," she told Eli, not unkindly. "Let me see." She had some experience with this. Her father had been a farmer, and farmers broke things regularly. She sent for clean cloth, sent for the straightest piece of scrap wood anyone could find, and she and the Pratt woman splinted the leg the way Eleanor had seen done when she was 12 years old and her brother fell from the haymow. Eli bore it with a silence that was pure Thomas. Not stoic exactly, but concentrated, turned inward. Afterward, when Eli was settled in the back of Thomas's wagon and Eleanor had washed the blood from her hands with water she could not really spare, Thomas came to find her. He had not, in 6 weeks, asked her for anything. He stood at the back of her wagon with his hat in his hands and said, "I'm going to be needed with my boy. I can't drive your team and be with him both." "I know," she said. "I don't know how long." "Thomas." She waited for him to look at her. "I know." He did look at her then, and something passed between them that had been building without either of them choosing it, the kind of thing that grows in the space where 2 people have been honest with each other under pressure, when neither one has had anything left over for pretending. Not love, not yet. Something earlier than love. The ground love grows in. "I can drive my team," she said. "I have been driving it." He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He went back to his son. July became August. Eli healed slowly, the way bones healed on the trail. Not with rest, because rest was not an option, but in spite of constant motion, the body insisting on its own repair. He was walking on the leg by Fort Hall, at mile 1400. Though he walked with a hitch that Thomas watched from the corner of his eye and said nothing about. Eleanor drove her team. Every day from wagons roll out to the evening circle. Her arms strengthened. Her eyes learned to read the trail 20 feet ahead. She stopped flinching at the sound of deep water. There were hard days. The Snake River crossing at Salmon Falls. The water running cold and fast and brown with silt, the depth unpredictable, was the worst. Eleanor's lead ox balked at the water's edge, and she climbed down from the bench and stood in the current up to her knees, in August, talking to the animal with a patience she did not feel until the ox finally moved. When she climbed back onto the bench, her wet skirts dragging, she looked straight ahead and did not allow herself to think about what would have happened if the ox had not moved. James, from inside the wagon, "Mama, are you very brave?" She said, "I am very cold." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh like that in a long time. The Blue Mountains came in mid-August. Oregon. Real Oregon, at last. Tree-covered slopes that smelled of pine and cold water after the long alkaline dust of the Snake River Plain. The wagon train made camp one evening in a clearing where a creek ran past, and Eleanor sat outside after the children slept and listened to it. Water that was cold and clean. She cupped her hands and drank. Thomas came and sat nearby, as he had learned to do, not presuming, not crowding, just present. They sat without speaking for a long while. The creek moved. The pines stood in the dark around them. He said, eventually, My wife's name was Margaret. Eleanor looked at him. I don't talk about her much, he said. It doesn't mean I don't think about her. No, she said. I know. Another silence. A good one. I had a letter from a man in the Willamette Valley, Thomas said. He has land adjacent to what I've claimed. He says the soil is very good. Black, he says. Easier to work than anything in Ohio. Daniel wanted to grow wheat, Eleanor said. He said Oregon wheat was going to be something. He wasn't wrong, Thomas said. I've heard the same. They were talking about farming. They were not talking about farming. This is how it is, between two people of certain natures when they are both a little frightened of the directness of what they feel. They talk around the edge of it carefully, the way you walk around the edge of a stream you're not certain of the depth of. He said, Your land claim. It's next to a river, you said. The claim Daniel filed, she said. I don't know yet if I can hold it alone. The law is, she stopped. The law, as she understood it, was not kind to single women holding land. She had thought about this at length. It was another version of the same problem. You could not do certain things alone. That was simply a fact, like the weight of a wagon or the depth of a river. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have thought about this. She looked at him. I want to say it plainly, he said, because I think you are a woman who prefers things plain. He cleared his throat. Not nervousness exactly, more like a man choosing his words the way a carpenter chooses wood. I am not asking out of practicality alone. I want to be clear about that first, because anything I say next could sound like it is only practical, and it isn't. Eleanor waited. I have admired you, he said, from the beginning. Not for your suffering. A person doesn't earn admiration for suffering, but for what you've done with it. Every day from Fort Laramie on, I watched you figure something out that you didn't know how to do the day before. The oxen, the crossing at Salmon Falls, Eli's leg. You did not ask for any of it, and you did not complain of any of it, and I think he stopped. Started again. I think you are the most capable person in this wagon train, and I include Captain Hendricks, and I have thought so for some time. Eleanor said nothing. She was looking at the creek. I would like, he said, to be considered. That's all I'm asking. Not an answer now, just to be considered. She was quiet for a long while. Long enough that a lesser man would have apologized. Walked back some part of what he'd said, looked for a way to make it smaller. Thomas said nothing more. He waited. She said, Daniel was a good man. Yes, Thomas said. From everything you've said. I know. I didn't know it was possible to feel two things at once, she said. Grief and something else. I thought it would be one at a time. That seems foolish now. It isn't foolish. She looked at him. He was watching the creek with the same steady attention he gave everything. Not indifferent, just patient. There was something in the patience that she had come to trust in a way she had not expected to trust anything so quickly, or perhaps ever again. She said, I am not ready. He said, I know. She said, but I don't think that means. She stopped. Started again. I think there is a difference between not ready and not possible. Yes, he said quietly, there is. They reached the Dalles on September 3, 1857, at the end of a long descent through country that smelled of dust and fur and the cold breath of the Columbia River. The train had begun in April with 31 souls. It ended with 29. Both losses were to the trail, one to cholera, one to a river crossing in Idaho. Eleanor Marsh was among the 29. She stood at the Dalles and looked at the Columbia River and felt something that was not triumph. Triumph would have been too large, and she was too tired for large feelings. It was smaller than that. It was the feeling of setting something down that you have carried a very long distance, and realizing, with faint surprise, that you are still standing. Clara stood beside her. James sat on the wagon step eating something the Pratt woman had given him, entirely unaware that he was supposed to feel historical about this moment. Thomas came and stood at Eleanor's other side. Not touching, just there. She said, We're here. He said, Almost. Still the valley. Thomas, she said, with something close to warmth, let me have the moment. He looked sideways at her, and something came into his expression that she had not seen there before. A loosening, a light. He laughed, quietly. but she felt the surprise of it. How good it sounded. How right. The Willamette Valley was green in a way that Eleanor had forgotten green could be. After 5 months of dust and alkali and the tawny browns of the trail, the valley came at her like something impossible. Tall grass, stands of oak and fir, the smell of rain deep in the soil itself a dark black that crumbled in your hands the way good bread does. Daniel's land claim sat on a rise above a creek that ran clean and fast year-round. There was a cabin frame already standing, half-built by a previous claimant who had given up and gone back east. Eleanor stood in front of it and looked at it for a long time. She wrote in her diary that night, "Arrived. The frame of the house is sound. The creek is as described. The soil is very good." I believe Daniel would have been pleased. She paused. Then she wrote, "I believe I will be pleased too." Thomas Caldwell filed his claim on the parcel adjacent, 160 acres of black-soiled bottomland with a view of the mountains on clear days. That winter he and Eli built Eleanor's house before they built their own. She did not ask them to. She did not argue against it when they came, one morning in November, with tools and timber and the particular competence of men who know how to make something out of nothing. She cooked for them instead. She learned the valley's rhythms while they worked, which ground drained and which flooded, where the deer came through in the evenings, what grew here and what wouldn't. She planted the seeds she had carried the full 2,100 miles from Ohio in a tin box tucked inside her flour sack, the same flour sack that held her diary and the daguerreotype and Daniel's letters. The wheat came up in April. Green and certain, without apology. Eleanor Marsh and Thomas Caldwell were married in May of 1858 in a ceremony held outside because the nearest church was 12 miles distant and the day was too fine to be indoors. The minister came to them. James asked, the night before, if that meant Thomas was his papa now. Eleanor sat with this question for a moment. Then she said, "He is Thomas. And Thomas is very good." James considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old who would be 6 in August. Then he said, "Thomas knows how to whistle. Papa didn't know how to whistle." "No," Eleanor said, "he didn't." "Thomas can teach me," James said, and rolled over and went to sleep. She kept the diary all her life. When she died, in 1901, in the same house Thomas and Eli had built that first winter, at the age of 76, her granddaughter found it in the drawer of the bedside table. She read it through in one sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold. She wrote to her cousin about it afterward. Grandmother crossed the trail in 1857. She never once said she was brave, but I read her diary, and I think she didn't know how brave she was. Or perhaps she knew, and she just thought it was ordinary. Maybe out there it was. There was one page that had been worn softer than the rest from handling. The page for June 4, 1857. 3 words at the top in hard pencil. "I cannot continue." And below them, in a different hand, in ink, carefully, as though added years later by someone who knew the whole story and wanted it on record. But she did.